Hello, we're going to have a look at some examples of how data and information are used in society. The word society just means a group of people with similar characteristics. I think the easiest way to think about this is just how is the whole country affected by data and information being used? So here are just 4 big industries in the country, just to give you some examples of how data and information are used. You could be given different examples in the exam, and you might have to talk about how data and information is used. You might have to think on your feet a little bit here, but a lot of the same sort of examples can be reused, including some of these ones. So healthcare consists of hospitals and doctor surgeries, and also just how we look after ourselves as well. So in hospitals, clearly a lot of data is being recorded, especially if you were in, say, an intensive care unit. Lots of sensors are measuring things like heart rate and blood pressure to ensure the doctors are able to intervene if anything drops too low. Scans like X-rays produce data, which then has to be looked at by either a human or increasingly AI, which is able to detect things like broken bones or potentially things like cancer. And a lot of us now wear wearable devices like smartwatches. These also have sensors which are recording data really quite frequently, and you are able to look at that data to see trends like your resting heart rate or how long you slept for or things like that. Law enforcement refers to bodies like the police, and CCTV cameras, we maybe don't think about it in these terms, but these are collecting data all of the time. They're recording all of the time, collecting a vast amount of data. Most of that data is just sat on a storage device, never being looked at. But of course, if something happens, the police are able to look at that data, analyze it, and hopefully catch some criminals. When a serious crime happens, forensic services turn up and take samples. These again just sit there in a database, but will get analysed to try and find criminals. Even if a criminal isn't caught straight away, things like DNA sit on the database for years and years and years. That's why I often hear about people getting caught many years later, because the data was retained and then analysed later on. And the police collect loads of data about all of us really, but in particular people who have committed crimes. Their fingerprints, their DNA get added to their police database, and the database would also show up information about wanted criminals, for example, so that no matter where you move in the country, the police have access to the same data. They're able to run number plate recognition software and catch criminals up and down the country. The government have to record data on 60 million odd people in the UK, and passports are an example of where it's really important that the data is accurate and can be verified and is reliable, because the passport is what lets us into the country if we go away, and also this needs to get trusted by other countries as well, that these are accurate documents for people. Government only functions if it's getting enough tax revenue. It needs to keep track of what individual people owe, so they can chase and maybe prosecute people who are not paying tax. They also need to get data from organisations like banks in order to see if people aren't paying the tax they should be paying. For example, your bank might tell the government that actually you're earning a lot more than you are telling the government you are, which is a sign you might be avoiding tax. And this is a huge amount of data when you think about how many people are working and therefore are eligible to pay tax. And of course, the government need to make political decisions based on things like the economy. A huge amount of data is recorded about the economy, and then most importantly is analysed in order to try and make the right political decision. Transport refers to cars and then also public transport like trains. Google Maps is a really good example of how a huge amount of data is collected. This is called big data, as we'll look at in my next video. For example, this is a picture of London and the main roads around London. We can see parts of it are red and orange, indicating high traffic. You can also see some symbols indicating heavy traffic in central London. This is all generated because it's collecting data from individual people who are sat in their cars in heavy traffic. It's collecting that data, analysing it, and it knows, oh, they're all moving really slowly, therefore it must be heavy traffic. We also nowadays get lots of live information about individual vehicles, like trains, like buses, where the data is collected from those individual vehicles, analysed, and then presented to us so we can see when these are arriving. And we'll have more and more use of self-driving or autonomous vehicles. These need to collect a huge amount of data from their environments in order to detect objects and make decisions on where to move the car. So these are the sort of examples you'd be expected to give if you were given an exam question about how society uses data and information. You also commonly will be asked to evaluate use of information. So let's start by looking at some positive impacts. Let's hope there are some positive impacts, because that's the whole reason we're doing this course. This whole course is about data analytics. We can think of these impacts in terms of individuals, organizations, and society. I'm going to give you some examples. Again, you might have to think on your feet a little bit in the exam if you are given a slightly different scenario. So for individual people, a key benefit is we're able to have more personalized services because our data is being used to adapt what we are seeing. For example, a personalized Spotify playlist, which is created based on your previous preferences. Also, if companies are retaining information, our time is being saved because we're not having to re-enter information. For example, my credit card is being saved by my browser, so that whenever I buy stuff on different websites, I click a button and my card details are loaded automatically. That saves me time. And also things like Apple Watches might give you a better understanding of your own behaviors. It's monitoring you a lot of the time. That data is then analyzed and shown to you. You can learn stuff about yourself, like how long you're sleeping for, how many steps you're taking a day, things like that. For organizations, the benefits of them collecting and then analyzing data is it can give them a greater understanding of their target market. If they understand their customers more, they're able to adapt what they're doing and eventually make more money. And companies and governments make decisions all the time. Unless you are tracking this and collecting data, you can't really understand the impact of these decisions. It's important to understand which decisions were right, which ones are wrong. So if you learn from this, collecting and analyzing data can show this. And also, if you are collecting lots of data and then analyzing it, often you can detect evidence of any inefficiencies or maybe even errors. An inefficiency is where you are effectively wasting some resource. And of course, an error is an issue in your company. For example, a factory might detect that actually one machine is making a product slightly wrong, and it only detects that because it's recording lots of data about the testing. And lastly, all of this kind of collectively can lead to an organization having a competitive advantage over another company, which means they are able to make more money than another company. For society more generally, if we're using lots of data effectively, this can lead to more innovation by businesses, more variety in products. It might also make society feel safer generally. I'm thinking more about the law enforcement examples we looked at, like CCTV cameras or clear tracking of criminals. And public services like hospitals or public transport might run more smoothly if they're using the data effectively. But there are issues with collecting and analysing data, which we have to be aware of. Again, here are just some examples which you can adapt and use if you'd like to. For individuals, there's definitely this loss of privacy. People don't necessarily like companies or governments collecting lots of data about them. We tend to like to be quite independent as humans. That can feel like an invasion of privacy if our data is being collected all of the time. And some of this data is quite personal, and we wouldn't want an attacker or a criminal to get. The more data which is collected, the greater risk of data breaches, where a hacker might gain access to this data. Well, the key issue is if a hacker does get the data, the person who has suffered here could become a victim of things like fraud or identity theft, where things like their credit card details might get used by a criminal. And something which we'll talk a little bit more about in the future is there is a risk that with things like AI in particular, when AI is absorbing loads and loads of data in order to make its predictions, sometimes it learns underlying issues in the data, like discrimination, like bias. And if the AI absorbs that, it then uses it whenever it's making its predictions, which can lead to certain people being discriminated against because of this underlying bias. For organizations, to do data analytics properly requires a lot of time and a lot of specialism, which is expensive to hire specialist members of staff. They also have the same issue with data breaches, of course. For a company's perspective, it causes reputational damage if they are suffering from things like cyber attacks. And also, if they are seen to not have good security, they can suffer from very heavy fines. And another cost issue involved in collecting and analyzing data is if you are storing lots of data and processing lots of data, this costs more money for your hardware and also electricity. For society, the more data is being utilized by different companies, the more risk of misinformation creeping in, where the original data is not accurate and is not truthful. This can be increasingly hard to detect and also can spread really fast on things like social media. And as society relies more and more on technology, certain people can get left behind because they haven't got access to the same technology. For example, the elderly people, for example, people who are slightly poorer. This is not fair. It's often called the digital divide, where some people get the benefits of technology, some people don't. And one of the major issues with increased use of data, in particular when it comes to AI and machine learning, is there might be less need for humans in the process, which can lead to unemployment.